I had a dentist appointment that morning, which is the only reason I came home early. That's the part that still gets me, the entire chain of events that followed. The unraveling of everything I thought was solid and permanent in my life started because of a routine cleaning that got rescheduled from Friday to Tuesday. I worked from home on Tuesdays anyway, so I told my boyfriend I'd be back around noon. He said he had back-to-back calls and probably wouldn't surface until dinner. He kissed me on the forehead that morning before I left and told me to drive safe. I remember thinking, as I pulled out of the driveway, how easy things felt between us lately. How comfortable. How settled. That feeling lasted until I turned back onto our street and saw my best friend's car parked in front of our house. I didn't think anything of it at first. She had a key. She sometimes stopped by when she was between clients. She worked in real estate and kept strange hours. I actually smiled when I saw her silver SUV because I thought maybe we could grab lunch together. It had been a few weeks since we'd really talked. The kind of talking where you look each other in the eye instead of just trading voice memos. I parked in the garage, came in through the side door, and set my bag down on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet. No voices. No TV. Just that particular stillness that a house gets when it's keeping a secret. I called out. Nobody answered. I thought maybe they were on the back patio. I walked toward the living room, and that's when I noticed the shoes, her heels, the nude ones she wore to showings, sitting neatly beside the bottom of the stairs. His loafers next to them, which struck me as strange because he always left his shoes at the garage entrance, not here. My hand found the stair railing before my brain fully caught up. By the time I reached the top of the steps, the silence had a texture to it. Thick. Wrong. The guest bedroom door at the end of the hall was pulled almost shut, not fully, and through the gap I could see afternoon light falling across the floor in a way that told me the curtains were drawn in the middle of the day. I stood there for what felt like a very long time but was probably 3 seconds. Then I pushed the door open. I don't need to describe what I saw. The only detail that matters is that they both looked at me at exactly the same moment, and neither of them moved. Not for several seconds. Like they were hoping that if they stayed still enough, I might somehow disappear, or decide I hadn't seen what I had clearly, unmistakably seen. My best friend said my name. I stepped back out of the room and pulled the door shut behind me. I want to say I was calm in the way of someone who is at peace, but that's not what it was. It was the calm of someone whose mind has gone completely, surgically blank, a breaker tripping. A system shutting down unnecessary functions to preserve the essential ones. I walked into the master bedroom, sat down on the edge of our bed, and I stayed there for almost a full minute without moving. Then, I took out my phone. There was one person I needed to call. Her husband. We weren't close in the way that my best friend and I were close, but we'd spent enough time together over 3 years of double dates and holiday dinners that I had his number. I'd used it exactly twice, once to coordinate a surprise birthday dinner for her, once to ask if she'd left her sunglasses at our place. Both times he'd responded immediately. He was the kind of man who always answered his phone. He answered on the second ring. I kept my voice as level as I could. I told him I needed him to come to our house. I told him I couldn't explain over the phone, but that it was important, and that he needed to come now. He asked if everything was okay. I said no. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes. I spent those 15 minutes doing something that surprised even me. I didn't cry. I didn't go back to the guest room. I went to my boyfriend's home office, sat down at the desk I had bought him for his birthday last year, and I opened his laptop. We shared a password manager. His idea, actually. He'd set it up 8 months ago. Said it was more secure than using the same passwords everywhere. I had thought it was thoughtful. I had thought a lot of things. The laptop opened to his email, which was still pulled up from that morning. I almost closed it. I almost respected his privacy the way I always had. The way you do when you trust someone completely and can't imagine what you'd even be looking for. But I didn't close it. I typed her name into the search bar instead. The results loaded slowly, and for one suspended moment I genuinely hoped there would be nothing. 147 emails. The oldest one was dated 14 months ago. I opened the most recent one first. It was from 3 days earlier. She had written, Thursday works. He leaves for his site visit at 8. I'll be there by 9. Can't wait. He had written back, "Me too. Park around the corner just in case." I sat with that for a moment. Just in case. They had a protocol, a system. This was not a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was infrastructure. I kept reading. Not all of it, there were too many. And the doorbell rang before I got very far, but I read enough to understand that 14 months was only when they'd switched to email. Earlier references suggested the timeline stretched back further than that. My hands were very steady when I closed the laptop and went downstairs. Her husband stood on the front porch looking uncertain, like a man who had driven 15 minutes towards something he suspected was going to be bad and had spent the whole drive hoping he was wrong. I stepped aside and let him in. I told him what I had seen. I told him about the emails. I watched his face change the way a wall changes when the foundation beneath it shifts, not crumbling all at once, but cracking quietly from the inside. He sat down on the arm of the couch. He pressed both hands over his face. When he looked up, his eyes were dry in the way that happens when something is too large for tears. He said, "How long?" I said I wasn't sure yet, but at least 14 months that I could find. He exhaled. It was a sound I won't describe except to say that I recognized it, because it matched something that was happening inside my own chest in that exact moment. Two people in a living room, discovering at the same time that the lives they'd been living had been built partially on lies. He asked what I wanted to do. I said I wasn't sure yet, but I needed to understand the full picture before I did anything. I told him about the laptop. I asked if he was willing to go through it with me. He said yes. We went upstairs together. We were quiet on the stairs the way people are when they're trying not to announce their presence, even though the only people who needed to not hear us were still in the guest room at the end of the hall. We went into the home office and I opened the laptop again. I started further back this time. The emails were what I expected, affectionate, covert, full of logistical maneuvering around my schedule and his wife's. What I didn't expect was the thread that started about 8 months ago, shortly after I had made a fairly significant professional decision that I had shared with my boyfriend in confidence. I had told him I was leaving my job at the marketing agency to go freelance. I had told him I'd been approached by 3 major clients I'd been cultivating for years, and that they were ready to follow me into my own practice. I had told him the names, the industries, the contract values. He had listened. He had been supportive. He had asked a lot of questions that I now realized were not the questions of a supportive partner. I found the email he'd sent her the day after that conversation. He'd written, "She's going out on her own. 3 clients, decent size. I've been thinking if I position myself as a consultant before she formalizes anything, I could get in front of the same businesses. She trusts me. She'll introduce me if I ask the right way. We could be looking at a real setup here." She had written back, "That's smart. How do we make sure she doesn't notice?" He had written, "She won't. She's trusting. It's one of the things I you know." Her husband was reading over my shoulder. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She knew about this?" I scrolled down. There were follow-up emails. She had actually done research on 2 of my prospective clients. She had drafted an approach strategy. They had talked about timing, waiting until I signed my contracts, which would prevent me from easily sharing commissions or invoices, and then presenting themselves as a parallel service. They weren't just having an affair. They were building a business on the back of mine. I felt something cold settle into the center of my chest. Not rage, not even grief, exactly. More like a final, irreversible clarity, the kind that doesn't allow for doubt anymore. Her husband stepped back from the desk. He said quietly that he needed a minute. I gave him one. When he came back into the doorway, he looked different. Not broken, resolved. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "First, I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual about her business activity in the last year." He thought about it. He said there had been a new client she'd been cagey about. He'd asked once, and she'd changed the subject. He hadn't pushed because he'd trusted her. I asked if he had access to her business email. He said he might. She had given him her login once when she was out of the country and needed him to check something. He didn't know if she'd changed it since. He tried it on his phone. She hadn't. We spent the next 40 minutes in that office with the door closed, and by the end of it we had a detailed picture of something that went beyond personal betrayal into something considerably more serious. She had made introductory contact with at least one of my prospective clients, using language that very closely mirrored a pitch deck I had shared with my boyfriend 8 months ago. A pitch deck I had built over 18 months and shown to no one except him. Her husband photographed every relevant email. I forwarded what I needed to myself from my boyfriend's account. He had given me his master password himself, which meant I had every right to be exactly where I was. Then, I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Her name is Renata, and she has the particular quality of making catastrophic situations feel navigable without minimizing them. She answered immediately, listened without interrupting for 4 minutes straight, and then said, "Don't move anything, don't confront anyone, and don't let them leave until I get there." "I'm 40 minutes out," I said. "They're still in the guest room." She said, "Good." Her husband and I went back downstairs. We sat at the kitchen table. He made coffee because he said he needed something to do with his hands, and I let him because I understood that. Somewhere upstairs, the guest room door opened. We both heard it. Footsteps on the hardwood. Then silence, they'd heard us. Then my boyfriend's voice, careful and measured. "Nadia?" I didn't answer. More silence. Then her voice, lower. "I don't hear anything." Maybe she left. Her husband looked at me across the table. His jaw was tight. I shook my head slightly. Not yet. My boyfriend appeared at the top of the stairs. He was dressed. His hair was still slightly disheveled. When he saw her husband sitting at my kitchen table, something moved across his face so fast I almost missed it. But I didn't miss it. He said, "Hey, Marcus, I didn't know you were." Her husband said, "I know you didn't." My best friend appeared a step behind my boyfriend. She saw her husband first, and for one fraction of a second her expression was that of a person who has been caught and knows it, and hasn't yet decided how to respond. Then she chose a strategy, which was to rush down the stairs with her hands out and her eyes filling. She said my name. She said she was so sorry. She said I had to understand. I said, "Sit down." Something in my voice stopped her on the last step. I said, "Both of you, sit down." They sat at the far end of the kitchen table, which put 4 feet and about 14 months of lies between us. My boyfriend looked at her husband and then at me and said, "Nadia, I know how this looks. I know what you must be thinking. But it's more complicated than..." I said, "I've read your emails." Silence. He said, "What?" I said, "The account in the password manager we share. I've read them. All the way back to when you decided my client list was an opportunity." The color didn't leave his face all at once. It drained slowly, like water finding a crack. My best friend looked at him. He didn't look back at her. Her husband said very quietly, "I've read them too." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I said, "We're going to wait for my attorney to arrive. While we're waiting, I want you to understand something." I looked at my boyfriend, then at her. "I'm not upset because you hurt my feelings. I'm past that. I'm telling you this so you understand the scope of what's about to happen. You used information I shared with you in confidence to position yourselves in front of businesses I spent 18 months building relationships with. You used my trust as a competitive advantage. That isn't a personal mistake. That has a name, and it has legal consequences." My best friend said, "We never actually..." I said, "The intent is documented. The approach to my client is documented. The strategy emails are documented. Your attorney is going to tell you the same thing mine is about to tell me, but you'll hear it later, and I'll hear it first." My boyfriend leaned forward. His voice shifted into a register I recognized, the one he used when he was trying to manage a situation, calm the room, redirect the energy toward himself. He said, "Nadia, listen to me. Whatever you found in those emails, you're reading it out of context. I was frustrated with my own work last year. I was brainstorming. I never actually did anything with." Her husband put his phone on the table, screen up, showing the email she'd sent to my prospective client. My boyfriend stopped talking. Her husband said, "That client reached out to me 2 weeks ago. He mentioned he'd been contacted by a consulting team with a pitch that felt familiar. He showed me the materials. I thought it was strange at the time. I understand it now." My best friend's hands were flat on the table. She was staring at them. I said, "You were my best friend for 11 years. She didn't look up. I said, I was a bridesmaid at your wedding. I flew across the country when your mother was sick. I gave you the name of every single client I was building toward because I thought you might be able to refer people to me. And instead, you gave the list to him. She said, "That's not, I didn't give him a list. It came up in conversation." Her husband said, "Don't." She stopped. The room was very quiet. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the street. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon sounds pouring in through a house that had just fundamentally changed shape. My boyfriend tried once more. He said, "Everything between us is still real. Whatever business stuff got confused, that doesn't have to be." I said, "Stop." He stopped. I said, "You told her in an email that I was trusting. That it was one of the things you—" I paused. "You didn't finish the sentence. But I will. It was one of the things you counted on. You chose me because I was trusting. You stayed because it was convenient. That's not a relationship. That's a calculation." He opened his mouth. I said, "My attorney will be here in 20 minutes. I'd recommend you both use that time to call yours." Renata arrived at 37 minutes, which was 3 minutes faster than she'd estimated. She walked in with the energy of someone who has done this before and finds competence more useful than sympathy in moments like these. She shook my hand, nodded at her husband, and looked at my boyfriend and my best friend with the polite, interested expression of someone doing mental inventory. She sat next to me and set a folder on the table. She said, "I've reviewed the screenshots Nadia sent me on the way over. I want to ask a few questions with everyone present. And I want to be clear that anything said in this room can and will be relevant to the proceedings we're initiating." My boyfriend said, "What proceedings?" Renata said, "The claim related to misappropriation of proprietary business information. The pitch materials sent to Nadia's prospective client contain language that is substantially identical to a document she created and shared with you under the reasonable expectation of confidentiality. That's a starting point. There may be others." My best friend said, "We didn't sign anything. There was no NDA. She never." Renata said, "There doesn't need to be a signed agreement for a confidentiality expectation to exist within an intimate relationship. Courts have recognized this repeatedly. But I'm less interested in arguing the merits right now, and more interested in documentation." She looked at my boyfriend. "How many conversations did you have about her client development strategy in the past 12 months? He said nothing. Renata said, "Silence is also an answer, but a worse one." Her husband leaned across the table and said, "His emails reference at least 8 specific conversations. Dates, topics, what she shared and what he passed along. He kept records. Not to protect himself, he kept them for her." He looked at my best friend. He was documenting the arrangement. Something happened to her expression then. Not guilt. Exactly, guilt had already come and gone. This was the look of someone realizing that the person they'd been trusting had been building a paper trail that ran in both directions. She said, "You kept." He said, "We should have waited." She said, "You said it was fine. You said she would never." Renata interrupted gently. "I'd like to pause that particular conversation because it's going to become very useful later, and you're both going to want attorneys present before it continues." My boyfriend looked at me then. Really looked, maybe for the first time since I'd walked into this kitchen. He said, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I said, "I know. You meant for it to go exactly far enough that I wouldn't notice." He didn't have anything to say to that. Renata spent the next hour documenting, asking questions, and walking me through the immediate steps. She recommended a cease and desist regarding any further contact with my prospective clients. She outlined the process for a civil claim. She told me what I could reasonably expect in terms of outcome, and what I couldn't, and she was honest in a way that made me trust everything she said. Before she left, she stood in the hallway and said, "You did the right things in the right order. That matters." I said, "I almost didn't look at the emails." She said, "But you did." After she left, her husband helped me change the locks. He was handy in ways my boyfriend had never been, and he seemed to need something physical to do. My boyfriend had taken his things and gone to a hotel. My best friend had gone home to a house that was now a different place than it had been that morning. Her husband was sitting on my front steps when I came back out with 2 cups of tea. He said, "I keep thinking about the birthday party." I said, "Which one?" He said, 2 years ago. You organized the whole thing. You called all her friends. You ordered the cake she mentioned once in passing 3 months earlier. You stayed after to help clean up." He paused. "She was at that party making plans with your boyfriend." "I just didn't know it," I said. "I didn't know it either." He said, "Does that make it better or worse?" I said, "I think it makes it what it is." We sat with that for a while. The evening was warm, and the neighborhood was doing its ordinary things. Dog walkers, kids on bikes, someone's sprinkler moving back and forth. I had lived on this street for 4 years, and none of it looked quite the same as it had this morning, and I understood that it would eventually look normal again, but that it was going to take some time. He said, "What do you do now?" I said, "I build what they tried to use against me. But I build it for myself this time." He nodded slowly. I said, "What about you?" He said, "Same, I think, just a different version of it." The legal process took several months. There were conversations I had hoped to avoid and couldn't, and documents I had to read that made me angry in ways I hadn't expected. My best friend tried to contact me 4 times before her attorney apparently advised her to stop. My boyfriend sent a letter through his attorney that was, Renata told me, more of an apology than a legal document, which she said was unusual and also inadmissible. The client she had approached chose to work with me. He told me, in our first official meeting, that the pitch she had sent had felt somehow second-hand, like someone describing a meal they hadn't cooked. He said mine felt different. I told him he had good instincts. I saw her once more. I had driven to pick up some things I'd left at her house, a lamp, a box of books, and she opened the door before I could knock. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, and she said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything right now." I said, "It means something. It's just not enough." She said, "Will it ever be?" I thought about that honestly, the way I had learned to think about things since that Tuesday in April. I said, "I don't know yet, but that's a question for a different year." She nodded. She helped me carry the lamp to my car. I didn't hug her when I left, but I didn't leave without saying goodbye. It felt like the most accurate thing I could do, not coldness, not forgiveness, just the precise truth of where we actually were. Her husband and I stayed in loose contact the way that people do when they've been through something together and don't quite know what to do with that afterward. He texted me when his divorce was finalized. I texted him when I landed my 4th client, the one that made me feel like the business was actually real. He came to the small housewarming I had when I moved into a new apartment, and he brought wine and stayed for 2 hours, and at no point did either of us pretend that the circumstances that had made us friends were anything other than what they were, which is to say, terrible, and also, somehow, the thing that made us both start over. I think about that Tuesday sometimes when I'm in the middle of something good, a strong client meeting, an evening in my new apartment, a phone call with a friend who actually deserves that word. I think about the dentist appointment that got rescheduled, the car parked in front of my house, the shoes at the bottom of the stairs. I think about how close I came to not looking at the emails. There's a version of my life where I didn't look, where I made lunch, or laughed it off somehow, or waited for a different kind of evidence that might never have come, where I handed over my client list and my trust and my next 3 years to 2 people who had already decided I was useful but not essential. That version of my life ended on a Tuesday in April. I am not sorry about that. Not even a little. What I am is grateful for the clarity that comes when the thing you were afraid to see is finally in front of you, and you realize that knowing, even when it is devastating, is always better than not knowing. Grateful for a lawyer who answered her phone. Grateful for a near stranger who sat on my front steps and drank bad tea and talked about rebuilding like it was something we were actually going to do. Grateful that when I pushed open that door, I was still the kind of person who could walk calmly to a desk and start looking for the truth. Because here is the thing they miscalculated. They thought that trust was a weakness, that I was trusting because I was naive, because I couldn't see, because something was missing in me that was present in people who protect themselves. What they didn't understand is that trust isn't the same as blindness. Trust is a choice you make when you believe someone has earned it. And when they haven't, when the evidence is right there on a screen in front of you, 14 months and 147 emails deep. The same person who chose to trust can choose something else entirely. I chose something else, and I'm still choosing it, every day, in the direction of something that is entirely, finally, my own.